All right, Jeff, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is jig fishing. Now, we're not going to specifically talk about the jig itself. We're going to talk about my favorite part of my favorite topic, which is jig rod. So this is a question that we get asked all the time. We've made a gazillion jig rod videos, but every day we're getting questions on if I'm throwing a 3/8 ounce jig or a 3/4 ounce jig, which rod do I get? If I'm throwing a swim jig or a football jig, which rod do I get? So today we are going to break down our best-selling lineup of rods, which is the Megabass Destroyer P5 line. There are 6 dedicated jig rods in that one lineup, so it can get really confusing and cloudy as to which one will perform the best for which jig. So today we're just going to geek out. We're going to go down some rabbit holes. We're going to break down my favorite jig line, the Destroyer P5 series. Let's do it. Welcome to the Hookup Tackle.
Oh, what a stud.
Yeah. Look at that.
That was sick.
Cheers, my friends. Happy Sunday. All right, guys, some breaking news. What's new this week at the Hookup Tackle?
What a beautiful post-long fish.
Look at that.
Look at that gut on that.
That's a nice fish.
Welcome back, my friends. I am Ben with the Hookup Tackle, the Tackle Otaku on Instagram, being joined by my buddy Jeffrey the King. What's up, Jeffrey the King?
What's going on?
You know what's about to happen, don't you? I'm tapping a can.
Oh, this part. Skip.
You know, my throat is just feeling dry.
Skip this part of the video.
Oh, it's so much better already. I like videos where I get to drink beer. Why don't I just sit here and you talk about jig rods?
What, you just drink a 6-pack real quick?
Yeah.
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 That's
Or
great.
8.
That's great.
Yeah, they come in 8-packs.
Of course they do.
That's what I tell my wife.
That's
I only drink 1 pack.
only 1 pack.
All right, this is a cool conversation that I love having. Bottom contact jig and worm rods can be so misunderstood because there are so many different kinds of rods, so many different tapers, and every brand from Loomis to St. Croix to Megabass to Jackal, like everybody brands their tapers and their powers so much differently than one another. So sometimes, you know, a medium heavy fast action in one rod doesn't mean the same thing in another rod. So there's not really like a universal language that works for every brand, right? So today we're going to dive down the Megabass Destroyer P5 line, which has become one of our favorite lines, our best-selling line here in store. I was born a Loomis jig and worm person, right? So everything is always, the standard is always against Loomis, right? So even now, anytime I talk about a jig rod, I want to talk about it in terms as compared to an NRX, because that's always, to me, going to be the industry standard, right? Just because, dude, we were born in Arizona. You're born in Arizona, you're born with a Loomis, right? But over the course of the last couple of years, a lot of brands have caught up to getting very close to them in sensitivity, but offering different grips, different actions, different tapers that sometimes can be a lot more fun. And so I find myself in this rabbit hole most of the time with most baits. Now, jig fishing can be super confusing because there's so many different styles of jigs and so many different ways of doing it. And we can put worms into this category too. So when we're referring to jigs, this could be jig and worm, right? So basically the 3 kinds of jigs that really everybody kind of uses is compact finesse jigs, okay? So this would be something like, here's a little Raid Igudama, a little OSP hunch jig, something in maybe like a 1/4 to a 1/2 ounce, but small body, small little trailer, maybe a 2 or 3 inch trailer on there, tiny little jig, right? Next category would be like a traditional football jig. And I would say most people use like a 1/2 or 3/4 ounce football jig. Now, this compact style is super popular. This is a depth jig, or it could be a K-Tech or OSP. This is a dirty jigs, 3/4 ounce with a full-size trailer on it, OSP Beaver. So, you know, something like this would be kind of the next category. The third category is like a swim jig, right? This is a bait that you're going to use, and you're going to be in more of a constant retrieve with this thing, right? In between all of those can be things like dark sleepers, worms, Texas rigs, free rigs, so on and so forth, right? But once you kind of understand the tapers of these rods and how they work, it will make sense for what other techniques go along with them, okay? So let's start right here. I think this is probably the easiest place to start, and this is on the heavier side of the jig spectrum. And these are two that get asked about a lot. So I think this makes the most sense, and then we'll kind of work our way backwards through the line. Okay, so the two rods in my hand are two new additions to the line. This is the P5 BMG, and this is the P5 FMJ. Okay, now both of these rods built and designed for bottom contact. Both these rods built and designed for jig and worm fishing. Why do you choose one over the other? Well, they're built in two different ways. You can certainly just go through and spec them, right? So if you spec them, the BMG is 7.5, it's 1/2 to 1.25 ounces, okay? And the FMJ is 7.3, it's 3/8 to 1 ounce. So kind of the same, but really the difference between these isn't so much the spec, it's how they're built. Okay, so the BMG is built as a dragging bottom contact rod. And what that means is it's going to be, you can see as I bend through here, this rod bends kind of deep into the rod. I'm already here at halfway through the rod, and I still have some bend. And it stops about there. So kind of this top half of the rod is bending because the rod is built as a dragging rod. Okay, so it wants you to take something like this, 1/2 ounce or 3/4 ounce football jig, big worm, big soft plastic, something like that. It wants you to throw it out, and it wants you to basically just be dragging this thing along the bottom. Okay, so it would be a good Carolina rig rod. So anything that you're dragging, the BMG is a good option. Because this rod tip is going to bend so much, it takes that rod to kind of be engaged. It's got to be under a little bit of load for the sensitivity to transfer to it, okay? But that's what it was built for. It was built for that drag so that you have control and you have power, but you're not going to feel that bite or, you know, that little finesse, little pickup unless that rod is engaged through the drag. So if you guys are using a big football jig and some sand, or you're just out on a flat dragging, the BMG is a sick option. But if you need the rod to have some slack line sensitivity and you want it to be a little crisper because you want to work the jig, you want to crawl it up over a rock pile and have it come over the top of a rock, right? Hits the top of a rock, and then you want it to fall down like this and be able to feel that slack line bite at the end, then you need a rod that's faster and more sensitive. So this is the FMJ, so you can see that right out of the gate, right, it's much faster. So you can see it's not bending near as much in that top third as the BMG. So even though the BMG is rated higher, you see how much more, like when I pull it like this, how much more gradual that bend is versus this guy, right? So it's much more at the tip. Okay, so this is going to be a crisper, more sensitive slack line rod. But because it's so fast, it's a little too fast, I would say, for dragging. You can use it, but usually when you're dragging, that little extra length is better, like in that 7.5, because you're usually on a longer cast, and you're usually dragging and you feel, oh, some pressure, that's a fish. You kind of wind down, you sweep set. It's good to have that extra length. With a rod like the FMJ, this is a rod that usually I'm going to throw out here and I'm going to kind of fish directly at my jig. I'm going to crawl it along, I'm going to hop it along, I want to feel everything that it's kind of going against. I might kind of hop it, let it fall back down, and I want to feel that fish suck it off the bottom and have that slack line sensitivity. Okay, so that's when I'm gonna go FMJ. So you can do either. Which is the best 3/4 ounce or 1/2 ounce football jig? Well, both of them. They're both equally as good. It just depends how you're fishing. If you need the most sensitivity and crisp movements, FMJ. If you want deeper water and just kind of dragging along, BMG. Now, we're gonna take that same principle, those same things that we just talked about, and we're gonna step down in power a little bit. So now we're gonna move into more of this compact or finesse football jig. Okay, so these would be, you know, something like an OSP hunch jig, little Igudama jig, little K-Tech jig, something like that. Something that's small and compact to where the movements you want to be really precise, right? You can't take a big 7.5 heavy jig rod and this tiny little 1.5 inch jig and have any kind of finessey movements, right? This jig needs to move slow and methodical along the bottom, or it's gonna look crazy with these big, huge movements, right? So we've got to scale down into a more finesse option. And Megabass has two options almost identical to what we just talked about, but in lighter tapers. So in this realm, they have a rod that's been on the market for quite some time. It's the X Bites. It's become a favorite for a lot of guys. And then they have the Daemos, okay, which is a new offering. Okay, so if we spec them out, the X Bites is an f5.5 7.2x. The Daemos is an f5 7.2x. Okay, lure rating on the Daemos is 3/8 to 1. Lure rating on the X Bites is 1/4 to 1. So kind of the same, right? But just like the BMG and FMJ, they're kind of built the same. So the X Bites is built as more of a dragging style rod. So you can see as I bend this, it bends kind of far down before it kind of engages. Okay, so it's a great one for throwing those little compact jigs, but really as something that you're more kind of dragging, or maybe a hybrid of hopping and dragging, right? So a lot of times you end up dragging your bait in lighter size. Like this is a 7-gram jig, right? So it's a 1/4 ounce jig. So a lot of times you get a little breeze and you made a long cast, you got a little wind. A lot of times you can't just work your rod straight up. You kind of have to have a little bit of a drag just to be able to maintain bottom contact. The X Bites is an amazing rod for that because it's got that softer tip, but it doesn't take it halfway down the rod to engage. It can just be under a little bit of load, and then that sensitivity transfers to it. Now, on the flip side, the Daemos is kind of similar to how that FMJ was. You can see that as I start putting pressure on this front tip, it's kind of just at the tip. Okay, so it's a much faster rod, it's a much quicker rod, so this is going to transfer sensitivity better on a slackline hook set or slackline basically bite detection. So this is going to fall over a rock and it's going to fall and fish eats it before it gets to the bottom. The Daemos is going to perform a little bit nicer on that, but it's much faster. So you have to be careful that you don't impart too much action into the jig as you're pulling and sliding it. It may be a little bit overpowered for something like a little 1/4 ounce. So again, you kind of have to balance this out here and see which one you like. But that's basically how you decide between the two. You want it to be faster, a little crisper, you can go Daemos. If you want to have a little bit more dragability, the X Bites is nice. All right, two other rods we're going to talk about that are kind of just unique rods in their own, well, they're unique rods. This one is the Tak Shaft, okay, or the Tachyon shaft. So this is kind of one of those, I would say, weird ones. It's an f6.5 6.7x. It's a 1/4 to 1.25 ounces. It's a short rod. It's a crazy fast rod. It was designed by Megabass for being the hardest hitting, fastest sensitivity transferring jig rod that they've ever made. That was the idea behind building this rod. So this is a rod that in Japan was designed for skipping docks, for close range target casting. Okay, this isn't a rod that you're going to want to take out on the big water and heave a 3/4 ounce football jig as far as you can. This is going to be a close range, high impact rod. So you can see, like, there's almost no bend to this rod. It's fast, okay, super fast. So it's not going to throw lighter jigs very well, even though it says 1/4. Do not try to throw a 1/4 ounce on this rod. It's going to miss your target by like 6 feet. Okay, you're going to aim there and it's going to go over there to the left. Okay, so you really, this is like a true half-ounce rod, total weight, half-ounce or 5/8. So you use a 3/8 ounce jig, put a crawl on it, it's going to be half-ounce. Something like this, you know, something like this, a half-ounce with a crawl, you're going to be at 5/8. That's really where this rod wants to shine. Skipping, close target, but super fast. So everything is going to happen very quickly. Okay, so you're going to skip it in there. You're going to feel everything that happens. If the bite happens, you've got a very fast response with this rod for hitting the fish and pulling them out of cover all in one motion. So the biggest thing I'll preface with this rod is because it's so fast, it doesn't have a lot of forgiveness, you want to make sure that your hook sets are controlled and smooth. Okay, so there are many different ways to set the hook. We talk about it maybe not as much as we should, but if you're going straight fluorocarbon, which most of us will probably be doing on a jig, you want to make sure that you're not snapping on your hook set. Okay, so if you're pulling back and you feel that bite and it goes thunk, you want to make sure that you're not just dropping the rod down, creating slack, and then cracking the whip to where that line is snapping, because that's usually where you're going to break fish off. So this rod's super powerful. Okay, so you're going to lift up, you're going to feel the bite, you're going to wind down, and it's going to be a pull. Okay, it's going to be a slow, controlled pull that's going to pull them away from cover and then just crank them. Okay, so let the rod do what it's designed to do, just don't overset on those guys. Okay, and then finally, there is one of my favorite rods of all time, the Dark Sleeper. Okay, now the Dark Sleeper is an F4.5 7.1X. I'll spec it for you. It's a 1/4 to 1 ounce, so it's kind of almost everything has the same lure rating, and it's making sense why this can be so confusing. When you're just looking at ratings, a lot of times it doesn't make a lot of sense that there's so many options. But the Dark Sleeper rod was really designed as a swim jig rod. So this is a rod that is also going to bend quite a bit through. It's going to need to be under load to have any kind of sensitivity. So this is a rod that's built to throw something like this, something that you can throw and just be swimming through the column. You can be dragging it on the bottom. You can be swimming it up and down branches or through trees or through grass. That's really where the Dark Sleeper is going to be good. Something like this, actual Dark Sleeper, great. Something like a sleeper crawl, even, great. Because the rod needs to have a little bit of that pull, right? And a little bit of that load to really engage. The Dark Sleeper rod is also a great option. It's just kind of an all-around rod. So spinner baits, hard baits. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do with the Dark Sleeper rod. We use it for a lot. So it's one, in my opinion, I would put it up there as maybe the best junk rod in the shop. I can throw topwater on it. I can throw dippers on it. I can throw swim jigs on it, spinner baits, buzz baits. I mean, you can do a lot of different things with this rod. But from a jig standpoint, it's really designed as a swim jig rod. Now, why would I choose this one over, say, the BMG, right? Because again, it was kind of designed that same way to where it had to have that load. Well, the difference between these two rods is the BMG is 7.5 and it feels like a stout rod. This is 7.1, it weighs nothing, it feels like nothing. So this is a rod that's just going to complement a 1/4 ounce swim jig, 3/8 ounce swim jig, you know, maybe a 1/2 ounce, something in that lighter realm that, you know, I can make either, you know, faster movements with, or I can make shorter little pulls with. It's just going to be a much more precise rod for lighter weight baits. BMG is just a bigger, heavier, all-around rod that's going to be better for heavier jigs, 1/2 ounce, 3/4, 1 ounce, kind of dragging them around. That's going to be more in its wheelhouse. Okay, so Dark Sleeper, amazing for what it's built for, but where it lacks is in that slackline sensitivity. So could you throw like a football jig with it? Of course, but it's really not going to give you any slackline sensitivity if you're trying to like crawl the jig up and over a rock and then it fall down a couple feet. You're not going to feel the bite. Bite will happen, nothing's going to transfer because that rod has to be engaged and under load for anything to give you feedback. Okay, but for something like a swim jig, spinner bait, that kind of stuff, it's unbelievable. That's the Dark Sleeper. All right, guys, so that is a wrap. So now, after all of that, is there a reason to have all 6 of those rods? Of course, yeah. absolutely. Probably 2 or 3 of each
I
minimum.
would think so.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm gonna go jig fishing, I need to have 18 rods, minimum, right? But if I had to choose one,
Ooh.
okay, the FMJ is the most versatile all-around bottom contact rod in their lineup from a jig fishing standpoint. Okay, so most jig fishermen want slackline sensitivity. Like, that's a thing, right? We want to be able to crawl a jig over and have it fall down and thunk, feel that bite. So if we're looking for a dedicated bottom contact jig and worm rod, I'm choosing this. I would have chosen the BMG if we were talking about more all-around use for other things. So like for me, like BMG is probably the best 6-inch mag draft rod I've ever thrown. It throws a big wake bait really good. It throws a big soft plastic like a bull flat. It throws that kind of stuff incredibly well. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about jigs, right? So I would go with the FMJ. If you're more of a swim jig fisherman and you like junk rods, then I would go with the Dark Sleeper. I feel like if I had these 2 rods, a Dark Sleeper and an FMJ, I could almost accomplish everything. Now there's certainly things that are going to fall out of the spectrum, like if you throw a lot of these smaller finesse jigs, the X Bites, the Daemos are going to be important rods for you to have. But day in and day out, if you're like 3/8 half-ounce football and some swim jig type stuff, these 2 rods can make it happen for you. So on that note, hit me with questions. What did I not cover, or what did I mention that you have more questions on? So if you have any questions, drop it down below in the comment section. I will definitely get to it. Jeff will put links to each of these rods. You want to check them out. And I said this before, we can go down rabbit holes all day on rods. I love talking rods. So hit me up on Instagram. Of course, you can hit me here. And if you have any rod questions, I want to make sure that you're as dialed as you can be so your jig fishing is as enjoyable as it can be. And that's it. Cheers, Jeff. On behalf of myself and Jeff and everybody here, cheers, guys. Thank you for giving us time. Thank you for watching our videos. Thank you for the business. And we will see you again soon. Peace out.